All righty. Well, welcome everyone, and so good to see you. So let's see, we had our intros, and I think sitting for a few minutes would be a really nice way to settle in and allow the cares of the day to recede. So let me get my phone for the timing. Okay, time and timer and two. Okay. Thank you, everyone. So before we begin, does anyone have anything that they'd like to share from last week? Anything that stood
Thank,
out, Marianne?
yes, thank you very much, Rosalie. Rosemarie, I'd like to thank you for the reference to the book, The Circle of Zen. Was that it? The
Circle of the Way, which
Circle of
you can
Way.
also thank Ellen because Ellen shared it with me.
Ellen, also, thank you
Hi,
so much.
Ramona.
I've been really enjoying reading this, and it's very accessible and lovely. Thank you.
Very welcome. Anything else that stands out for anybody from last week that they'd like to share before we move on? Okay. So we left off last week with the Buddha's enlightenment and his discovery of the Four Noble Truths and his compassionate impulse to teach. So fast forward, this is a short, class that we have here this week and next week, so we really have to move forward to his imminent death, his sickness and his imminent death at age 80, and his need to transmit the Dharma to a successor. So he called an assembly of all his disciples, but he didn't speak. Instead, he held out a flower, and only one of his disciples, Mahakashapa, smiled. It was this response that entered Buddha's heart and transmitted the Dharma to Mahakashapa. So there's actually a whole Dharma talk, I think, in this story. Mahakashapa's heart met Buddha's heart through Buddha's offering gesture of the flower, which Mahakashapa received by offering his smile. So Buddha did not use words, but a gesture of generosity to offer something gentle and beautiful. So in the midst of an atmosphere that we can imagine was filled with intense anticipation about Buddha's choice of a successor and grief over his illness and expected death, he, Buddha, sees that only one person had the capacity to go beyond these concerns and be fully present in this moment. Mahakashapa invited the Buddha and the flower in. So we're going to move to a Dharma activity. So just listen first and then you'll get some instruction on what we're going to write about again. So here's the question. What is Mahakashapa's secret? How has he trained with the Buddha to always be ready for what is being offered? How can we remain in such spacious yet intimate awareness that something simple and lovely, some beauty, some kindness right in front of us is not hidden by the louder, more distressing aspects of life? How was it that Mahakashapa's grief at the anticipated loss of the Buddha could open the door to his receptivity to the Buddha's offering? So you have two options. One is think of a time of grief in your life and how turning towards that grief might have opened the door of your heart to something that was offered. Or imagine Mahakashapa at this assembly. What is he experiencing? What does he feel when he sees the Buddha? I'm sure quite in bad shape, very ill, enter the room. And what's his process that he responds in this way to the Buddha? So we're going to get into groups of two, write for 8 minutes, and then as we did last week, one person will share what their experience was, and the other person 1 minute, and then the other person will say what it was like so just to give feedback to the first person, and then reverse. Any questions about that? Do you want me to repeat any of it? Okay. So I think you got the whole, what is Mahakashpa's secret? What gave him the ability, the capacity to respond the way he did? So for you, 2 options. Think of a time of grief in your life and how turning towards that grief opened the door of your heart to what might be offered. Or imagine Mahakashapa at this assembly. What's he experiencing? What does he feel when he sees the Buddha approach the room? What does he feel when he sees the Buddha offer the flower? How does he get there to the response that he had? Okay, good. Any questions? Okay, so let me put us into breakout rooms. Oh, so let's come back at, I think I can do I'll put a timer on it. So it'll be a total of 13 minutes. I'll put the timer on. Thank you. Would anyone like to share their experience? I'm curious, did anybody choose to be Mahakashapa? Or did everyone choose to? You did, Melissa, could you share? I mean, would you like to share? You don't have to, but.
Jace.
Oh, Jace. Sorry. Jace, did you want to say?
I I chose to write from the perspective of Mahakashapa. I thought it was I at first I thought about like being, one of these men that's been following the Buddha around northern India for, decades. And one thing that always strikes me about these stories is that, they followed this man that they walked a lot. They were like, oh, and they walked 100 miles. And I don't know if you've ever walked 100 miles, but it's a very long way. I've never done it in one shot. But even walking 10 miles is a far way, but walking 100 miles 2000 years ago without much like modern equipment, it's a lot. So you've given up your family, you've given up your life, and you've been following this man, and like, I mean, it's like kind of like your own life is coming to an end in a way, right? Like there's like the anticipation of grieving, and I think all of this is like it's kind of in the air. Like there's got to be some anxiety too, and there's also this like, okay, we have this natural inclination to grieve things we lose, but then also like, the Buddha's been like giving these teachings for decades about non-self and impermanence. So it's like they all knew that this is all coming to an end, and it's like they can't even cling to the master in this case. So it's like this, I think this kind of imagining that, and then wondering like how's he gonna pick a successor? Like who could he pick? Like he can't show preference. Is he gonna try to there be a test, or like just kind of thinking about that, and then uh ultimately seeing the flower and kind of wondering if it's a sign. And then I can imagine him seeing it. It's kind of like a sign of there being no sign, like not getting stuck on like signs and symbols, and just kind of seeing the beauty of this moment of the flower. And uh, it's like all these things are just kind of rising and passing away, and it just like all he can really do is smile.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It sounds like very creative, yeah, experience. Melissa, did you want to share it all?
I can share a little bit. So I kind of did the same thing. Did first person uh, there in the room, and just had him thinking and looking at the people around him, and not kind of wondering how the choice was going to be made, but not really. I think he would just be very present in the room and thinking about the people and wondering what they were thinking, you know. And then he sees Buddha come in, and he's obviously much more frail than he's used to seeing him, and yet he well, what I said he said is that um, even though the Buddha came in and looked very frail, the joy and uh, something anyway, the joy of Buddha was still there. That was also present in the moment. So, and that's as far as I got.
Thank you. Okay. All right, so let's move on. And I wanted to emphasize the importance of this moment, of the first transmission of the Dharma, because it's the beginning of the lineage of Buddhist ancestors. And why is that important? Because Buddhism is kind of unique in that the Dharma is personally transmitted to specific persons who then teach and so on down, all the way down to Appamada and our senior teachers, Flint Sparks and Peg Syverson. So in most religious traditions, the leaders are taught from texts and from classes, but this is really different. And next week, if we have time, I'm going to show you the lineage papers that if you study the precepts and you sew your rakasu, this garment here, which I don't know if you've all seen them, but it looks kind of like this. It's like quilted kind of. And you then, there's a ceremony where you receive the lineage papers all the way down to Flint and Peg and yourself. So it's really very, very personal tradition. Moving on, I wanted to show you the different schools of Buddhism, that now this is kind of leading us into how things developed with Buddhism. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see here. Share screen. Oops. Share screen. And okay, how does that look? Good? See it? Can I have a volunteer to just kind of read down? So we're looking at the three schools of Buddhism. This is kind of a silly thing. When I try to remember things that I would not ordinarily remember, I use an acronym. So for Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, I came up with TMV, which sounds to me like the DMV that we go to for our cars. So you might, like me, you might remember the acronym and not remember the names, but at any rate, that's just a little something. So would somebody like to read the Theravada part, which is the earliest school? Marianne?
Yes, sure. Theravada from 500 BCE forward. The emphasis is on earliest scriptures, emphasis on individual liberation, began in ancient India, about the 3rd century BCE, Sri Lanka. I'm not good. What does BCE stand for again? I forget.
Before the Common
Before
Era.
current.
Before Common Era. Okay, what's the little C in
Century.
front?
Century.
Okay, thank you. All right,
Sure.
thank you.
Somebody want to go for Mahayana, which
Wait
is
a minute, before common what? I mean, with the, I don't,
era.
Used to be
Common Era.
before Christ, but
that's
now,
what I was gonna
Yeah.
say. That's what I always think
now
of.
they call it, okay, before Common Era.
Common Era, okay.
That's the latest. Somebody want to read the Mahayana?
I'll go.
Jace?
Mahayana, 1st century BCE to present. Emphasis on compassion and social concern as much or greater than individual liberation. Origin in ancient India, leading to Zen. In medieval China, Bodhidharma arrived from India circa around 475 current era. A form of Mahayana Buddhism developed in China. Buddhism met Chinese culture, a new form of Buddhism, Chan, intense, formal, while simple and poetic, even funny in its literary form of koans. And this split into the Soto school in Japan in the 14th century and Rinzai.
Question mark. And everybody, and want to do the Vajrayana? Okay, Ramona?
Sure. Vajrayana, the 5th century CE forward, the Buddhism of Tibet, adds detailed esoteric ritualistic practices, medieval India.
Thank you.
Mhm.
That's really a quick overview. Let me get back to my, okay. So, so as we embark on this journey from India west to China, I'd like to start by looking at the 3 marks of existence that Buddha taught. And you're going to see how 2 of them, in particular Anatta and Anicca, are so relevant to how Buddhism evolved in China. So I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to look at another chart. Okay, let me make this a little bit bigger. Okay. So would someone like to read the 3 marks of existence? Oh, Ramona, thank you.
Okay. Sure. 3 marks of existence. Dukkha, all existence is bound up with suffering, dissatisfaction, distress, physical and psychological. Anatta, nothing whatsoever, including social structures, institutions, relationships, has any independently existing self. And how do you say that? Anicca?
I think Anicca.
Anicca. Everything is impermanent, existing in a state of flux, a part of a continuous process of coming into being, maintaining an existence, declining, and ceasing to be.
Thank you. I'll go with Buddhism arrives in China. And the reason that I have Anatta and Anicca bolded is because I felt that these 2 marks of existence are demonstrated in what happened when the Buddhist teachings arrived in China. And the book that I used to learn about this confluence of the Chinese culture and the Buddhist teachings is Peter Hershak's Liberating Intimacy. So these ideas that you're going to see here were very much from that book, and there'll be more about that book going forward. So a virtuosic flow, and I put the asterisk because Peter Hershak uses that word a lot. A virtuosic flow, a continuous co-responding between Buddhist teachings and Chinese culture, with its 2 major influences, the Tao and Confucianism, begins. So this virtuosic flow and continuous co-responding between the 2 begins. Think of it as a continuous virtuosic jazz riff. Why virtuosic? Because these are all extremely well-developed teachings, meaning Buddhism, the Tao, and Confucianism, because these are all extremely well-developed teachings involving intense, continuous practice. Improvisation and spontaneity are available through the confluence of Buddhist teachings and Chinese culture. And from all of this evolves into Chan, which eventually evolves into Zen in Japan. So I'm going to stop sharing now. I know that's a lot to take in, but I thought it was important to show that. So just as the Buddha did not start his search for understanding suffering and the means to its relief in a vacuum, when Buddhism arrived in China, we're going to see how this virtuosic correspondence between Chinese culture and Buddhism developed into Chan. So according to legend, Bodhidharma, an Indian monk and the 28th patriarch of Mahayana Buddhism in India, arrived at the Shaolin Temple in China in 527, according to legend. He spent 9 years meditating, facing a wall in a cave of the Wuru Peak, and initiated the Chinese Chan tradition at the Shaolin Temple. Thereafter, Bodhidharma was honored as the first patriarch of Chan Buddhism, or the father of Zen. So Zen had already been in China by the time of Bodhidharma, but his approach was unique. Red Pine, who's an author using that name, states in the Zen teaching of Bodhidharma, he quotes Bodhidharma as saying, "Seeing your nature is Zen. Not thinking about anything is Zen. Everything you do is Zen." While others, end of quote, while others viewed Zen as purification of the mind or as a stage on the way to Buddhahood, Bodhidharma equated Zen with Buddhahood, and Buddhahood with the everyday mind. Instead of telling his disciples to purify their minds, he pointed them to rock walls, to the movements of tigers and cranes, to a hollow reed floating on the Yangtze River. And here's one of the most interesting things I've learned about the influence of Chinese culture on Buddhism. According to Peter Hershak in his book, Liberating Intimacy, the Chinese concept of person and the Indian concept of person and of suffering are very different. He creates, this is a quote from Peter Hershak. Achieving ideal personhood in the context of Hindu culture is a matter of freeing oneself from human relationships. Yet the Chinese understanding of person is profoundly relational. Ancestors are always seen as a function of their always ongoing relationships with others. The Indian view of the person is psychophysical, and the Chinese is socio-physical. So to illustrate this story, he retells the story of Kisagotami in this way. Quote, "Once there was a young woman named Kisagotami, the wife of a wealthy man, who had apparently lost her mind because of the death of her child. Carrying the tiny corpse, she wandered from house to house in her village, begging her neighbors to give her a medicine capable of reviving her baby. Finally, someone referred her to the Buddha, who was staying at Javatana. She approached the Buddha and, throwing herself at his feet, begged his assistance. He agreed to help and told her that in order to heal her child, he needed 4 or 5 mustard seeds from a house where no son, no father, no mother, no daughter or slave had died. Thanking the Buddha, Kisagotami set out, going from door to door in search of a house where death had never entered. Finally, she reached the very outskirts of town without having found a family that had not been visited by death. She returned to the Buddha, and in his quiet presence, her mind cleared. She understood the meaning of his words, and from that day on was one of his devoted followers." Hershak continues, "According to our usual set of presuppositions, the point of this story is that suffering is universal, that grief is an experience common to all of us, and one that is inevitable given the nature of sentient beings. I would submit, however, that among these presuppositions is a belief in the objectivity of identity, and hence in the reality of essences or universals, a belief that finds no purchase in the scheme of either early Buddhism or the Chan tradition. In fact, a consistently Buddhist interpretation of the story suggests that there are 2 alternative and profoundly practical implications of Kisagotami's trip through her village. First, she is made to realize that there is no free zone where impermanence and suffering do not reach. This is not to say that impermanence or suffering are everywhere the same, but only that there is no place in the world where one can go to avoid being confronted with change or crisis. Superficially, this means that no happiness can last indefinitely. But at a more profound level, the ubiquity of impermanence guarantees that no gridlock is intractable. No matter how hopelessly stuck or stricken we feel, this bondage is also something arisen only in passing. All situations are negotiable. Secondly, and Kisukatami learns that suffering always occurs in the context of a communally articulated life story. The Buddha does not simply tell her that everyone experiences grief, but asks her to go from house to house, inquiring of her neighbors, of each of them whether death has occurred there. It might be supposed that this is only a pedagogical device, a way of forcing a hands-on realization. But we have to recall that Kisukatami is not just a woman, a faceless player in a generic tale, but someone known with greater or lesser intimacy by everyone in her village. When she knocks on a door and asks if death has occurred in the home, rather than being answered with a brusque yes or no, her own pain will call forth that of the neighbor she meets. In all likelihood, she's invited into the house and haltingly told or reminded how the eldest son was to have been married just a year ago and on a routine hunting trip slipped down and fell into a ravine and broke his back. So, just moving a little bit forward. So all these people would have names and birth dates, distinctive traits and dreams. They are friends and relatives whose life stories include and are included in her own. In this sense, suffering is in actuality neither objective nor subjective, but profoundly and irreducibly personal and shared. She opens herself to their stories, entering back into them in full reciprocity by re-including them once again as active participants in her own. You could say it was a kind of co-witnessing. So we can see a little of this cross-pollination of Chinese culture and Buddhist teaching in this story. So I'd like to close tonight with, this is a little off topic, but bringing us to our current situation since the election. It's something that I found on audiodharma.org, and it actually brings us to the beginning of our class tonight because it is a story of the last year of the Buddha's life that Gil Fronsdale is going to share with us. So here's a story for you, another story for you. Let's see.
Day of story. This morning there'll be another day of storytelling from the discourses of the Buddha. And this time some of the story will be constructed out of the evidence, the pieces that are there. It seems that for the most part, the people who composed these earliest discourses called the earliest discourses of the Buddha weren't particularly interested in history or even biography, weren't really doing much of a biography of the Buddha. But there are all these little snippets of stories that exist. And some of them we can then connect the dots and understand a little bigger piece of the history of the times, the life of the Buddha. And so I'm going to tell some of this, what comes from the early discourses. Some of it's piecing pieces together, and some of it comes from a little bit later, the commentaries that also try to provide the bigger context for some of these stories. And a piece of what inspires this little discussion today is some of the work of Stephen Batchelor, who's done some of this work of also piecing together some of the evidence. So it has to do with the end of the Buddha's life, the context, that his times that he was coming, that he was, in his last year of his life. And what we begin seeing, if we start looking at the pieces, is that the society around him, much of what the society he knew and his people he was close to, were dying, or societies were beginning to fall apart, and war was happening, and kings were being usurped from power. And the Buddha's own disciples, the senior, closest disciples, were dying this last year of his life. And the Buddha, seemingly through it all, was calm, was peaceful, died very peacefully under some trees. And this contrast between the kind of, I call it, the society falling apart around him, and his peacefulness, is quite a contrast. And maybe it's something that's also relevant for all human times. And it seems like maybe almost every generation thinks that the world is falling apart around them. So this piecing things together begins with maybe in the last year of the Buddha's life, maybe when he was about 80. I think it says that in the text that the king comes to talk to the Buddha, and the king says, both of us are 80 years old. So Buddha is up in his home country, Sakya, up in the foothills of the Himalayas, and in parts of what now Nepal. And he was, I guess, on retreat or just living quietly there in his old age. And nearby was another kingdom of where there was a king, Pasenadi, who they had been friends for 40 years. Early in the Buddha's teaching career, they were at the same age. They were same age, and they had struck up a friendship. And for 40 years, they had 46 years or something, they had seen each other periodically, and were considered friends. And Pasenadi was also a student and very devoted to the Buddha. And this king was out and about and wanted to visit the Buddha maybe one last time in their old age. And so he went with his minister, who he apparently trusted, and they rode in close to where the Buddha was in the forest. And the king got off his horse or his elephant, whatever he was riding, and then he said to his minister, "I'm going to go in there and see the Buddha alone, and here, hold these things." And he handed over to the minister all the insignia, all the paraphernalia that represented the power of the king. His sword, maybe his crown or his turban, and different things that he had that were represented his authority. And the minister was a little bit perturbed, like, what's going on here? Is there some secret plan that he doesn't want me to be there and hear what's they're talking about? And so he was a little bit suspicious about what was happening. And then the king goes into the forest and sees the Buddha, and the king gives almost like a eulogy for the Buddha. It's almost like he's going to see him maybe one last time, and he speaks so in high praise of the Buddha. And that's the end of the story. The sutta just ends right there. But so the Buddha is 80 years old, old man. And then we have another discourse that has to do with the last, usually called in English, the last days of the Buddha's life. It's the story of his passing away. And that's a little bit more of a chronology over many months, actually. But it begins with the Buddha being almost about as far away from his home country as he could be in the world that he lived in northern India. And maybe some 300 miles, I'm not sure exactly how many, but quite far. So here was a man who was 80 years old, who had been in his home country, and then sometime later, and then over the next year, we don't know exactly when, He was 300 miles away in far to the south, in I think near the Bay of Bengal, something like that, and near what's now called Pataliputra, I think. And so, how did he get there, and why did he go there? But this story almost begins with the story of the Buddha now walking back home. So he came all the way down this 300 miles, only to kind of more seemingly turn around and go back up, back home to his home country. And what was, why such a quick trip? So the piecing it together, one idea is that the minister of the king who took all the king's paraphernalia, what the commentaries say is that this minister had a little bit of resentment for the king, and so he left and abandoned the king there in the forest, and left him with a horse and one attendant, and went back to the capital and handed the symbols of power to the king's son, who thereby usurped the throne. And the king came out of the forest without anything really except a horse. And so he went down to visit the other king at this place where the Buddha ended up going. And the other king was his relative. I think it was his son-in-law or his cousin or something. And they had been at war with each other over those 40 years' time, but they had made enough peace, and they were relatives, and the king Pesanetti had nowhere else to go, supposedly, so he went down to see his relative, the other king. And so he made this long trip himself as an old man, and he apparently was not in very good shape. Some of the texts say that he was kind of fat and a little bit lazy, and so he made this long trip, and he came to the capital where this other king, Ajatasattu, the one who'd killed his father, the story I told earlier, was reigning. And he came at night, and so the city gates were closed, and so he stayed in some place, slept in some home or hall or something outside, and then he died that night. The piecing this together, it seems that the Buddha knew about this, that his friend, the king, had been usurped and headed south. So the Buddha followed, maybe to offer support for the king or to intervene or something. But when he arrived at the capital, his friend had died. So there was not much reason to head back home, to stay there. So the Buddha then started marching home. But before he did, Ajatasattu sent his minister to talk to the Buddha, and said, I'm thinking about attacking the neighboring country, the country that's between Ajatasattu's country and the Buddha's home country, the place that Buddha had often been. And it was kind of a republic. It wasn't really run by a king. It was, and the Buddha's, and he asked the minister said, do you have any advice for us about, what do you think of this, us attacking and conquering this neighboring country? And the Buddha gives some advice, and I won't tell you what he said because of the time. And he prevented the war then and there, but in fact, in giving his advice about why he shouldn't attack, the Buddha unintentionally gave the clue for what the king had to do in order to attack the neighboring country, which he did then 3 years later successfully. As the Buddha then got up to leave and started heading north to his home country, he was going to cross a river, and there he saw another minister of the king Ajatasattu, who was beginning to lay down the ramparts or the walls for a great new fort in preparation for war. So here, war is at hand. War preparations are going on. The Buddha begins walking north, and he describes himself as an old man. And I wanted to read you this description the Buddha gives of himself. I am now old, worn out, venerable, one who has traversed life's path. I've reached the term of life, which is 80. Just as an old cart is made to go by being held together by straps, so the Tathagata's body is kept going by being strapped up. It is only when I meditate deeply that this body, my body, knows comfort, is at ease. So here's a person who's 80 in the ancient world, who's being held together by straps and bodies falling apart, in other words. And
I'm just checking in with folks because it is 7 o'clock and there are about 3 more minutes to this. So if anybody needs to leave, that's fine. But I'm just going to keep going with the recording. So just wanted to check in with everybody.
he's in pain. And only in meditation is he free of his pain. Back then they had no pain medication. And he's walking. This old man is walking. He's in pain. His minister, his close friend, his king, had just been usurped and had died. The other king is about to conquer a country that had embraced the Buddha and had been a kind of a place that Buddha had lived a lot. And that was being attacked. They were getting ready to attack it. And in this long walk across back north to his home country, he learns that his 2 closest disciples had died. One had been killed by bandits, and the other had just died. And Buddha keeps walking, and at some point he gets diarrhea or dysentery, and is quite sick with lots of pain. And he gets revived enough, and he's heading home. But at some point, he realizes he's going to die. He doesn't reach home, and he finds 2 magnificent trees to lay down underneath. And he lays there, and never to get up again. And there he lays and spends his last time teaching his disciples. And then he carefully asks them, "Do you have any other questions for me before I die?" No one asks anything. And so the Buddha finally says his last words, be diligent. All things are impermanent. Everything is impermanent. Practice diligently. Carry on diligently, ongoingly. Carry on. And then he dies. And he dies by going into deep meditation states, and goes as deep as possible in what's possible through meditation. And then he begins coming out. And then in the 4th jhana, which is one of the most sublime places to be, maybe the ideal place in which to die, his life passed away. And this image of this man peacefully dying, at peace with himself, surrounded by his disciples, giving his last teachings, and then peacefully going into the one last journey in his deep meditation states. And in those states, his life passes away. And all around him, so he's spiritually, his inner life is deeply at peace, and peaceful setting in the woods under trees. But all around him, kings are being usurped, wars about to happen, people are dying. The Buddha is an old man, sick, in pain, walking up, through India, and he doesn't reach home. He's trying to get back to his home country. So the juxtaposition of a world out of kilter and the Buddha at peace. This is the end of the Buddha's time, his life. So what we think about that and how we live with that and understand that in relationship to our own life, perhaps what the Buddha said as his last words can apply to us as well. All things are impermanent. Practice diligently. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I just, that was kind of a last minute thing to add in based on what's happening around us and how we, through our practice together, can remain as serene as we can, and especially supporting each other, because what's happening, what I like about the Chan perspective is that what's happening is happening to all of us at the same time. That perspective is really helpful for me, anyway. Does anybody have any last minute things to?
Just thank you so much for that, Rosemary. That was great. Great.
Thank you.
All righty. Oh, Ramona, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I wouldn't mind having the handouts.
Oh, sure. Sure. I can,
The
yes,
one of the, yeah.
the
How
schools, the
Buddhism
schools.
evolved. Yeah, those 2
Mhm.
pages would be great.
Sure. I'm happy to send those off.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Bye.
Good
Enjoy
night,
your
everyone.
week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.